Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, a place to come for Olympian judgments about history, religion, and culture.
Insofar as that's possible through all the fog of media, culture wars, and crazed ideologies.
Yes, perpetual enemies.
My name is Lee Foster, and who are you again?
Uh, they told me to say Mike Pierce.
Okay, Mike Pierce, this is our final episode in the current series on the Crusades, and we're moving at warp speed through the later, rather fruitless Crusades before considering the legacy of crusading for the present.
So, first, the later Crusades. So, the Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, and it's called by Pope Innocent III in November 1215.
Now, we've met this pope before. I recognize the picture from the last episode.
Yeah, Innocent III had been Pope since 1198, and he was the one who had called the previous, that is the Fourth Crusade, which, yes, we looked at in the last episode.
Now, we made the point about the early Crusades that they weren't the result of a continuous ongoing policy, but they were way too far apart. The Second Crusade didn't happen until 40 years after the first one, the third didn't happen until more than 50 years after that, etc. That doesn't really seem to be true anymore.
Right, the later Crusades do seem to have an aspect of continuity with one another that the early Crusades lacked. The gaps in time are much smaller. Some of the same people are involved in them, and so on. So it started out in September 1217, including forces from Hungary, Austria, Germany, and the Low Countries. And the plan was to invade Egypt and move north from there. So their first target was the city of Damietta in Egypt, and that was captured in November 1219 after an 18-month-long siege. And when they'd done that, the Egyptian Sultan offered to come to terms, but the Crusaders pursued their advantage.
Yes, the Sultan actually offered to give the Crusaders Jerusalem if they would just get out of Egypt, didn't he?
Sadly, yes, the Crusaders forgot about their central purpose and frittered their advantage away by pursuing absolute victory. And that ended badly because they proceeded from there and they were heavily defeated at the Battle of Mansoura in August 1221. And so they couldn't maintain their position in Egypt at all. They abandoned Damietta and just got out. So that's the end of the Fifth Crusade. But let's just take a look at a couple of incidents from here. Here we've got Frisian Crusaders attacking a tower at Damietta, and here a much more recent painting, I think 19th century, just showing the siege of Damietta. After they'd captured it, they held the city for just 21 months. But perhaps the most eyebrow-raising incident is this. Here is Francis of Assisi, and he joined the Crusaders. He demanded to see the Egyptian Sultan, Al-Kamil, because he wanted to evangelize him, which was a bit of a big ask, a long shot. And remarkably, he survived. The Sultan listened to him respectfully and, without killing him, had him escorted back to the Crusader camp.
No, Francis is everybody's hero. He's probably better known today than any of the other people we've talked about.
Right, the last pope, who just died a year ago, remember, took the name Francis precisely to identify with Francis of Assisi.
But going to the Sultan seems like a suicide mission.
Yeah, the military leaders assumed that he was just going on a suicide
Yeah.
mission, but they let him go anyway.
Did the Sultan have any experience at all of Christians other than fighting the Crusaders?
He did had a load of Christian subjects because still in Egypt today, there are millions, many millions of Coptic Christians. So it wasn't like he'd had no exposure to them at all. But Francis, as in so many things, was a very different prospect for people to handle. But anyway, as we've seen, the Fifth Crusade ends in failure. The Sixth Crusade, which we've got here, 1228 to 29, was led by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Now, just to clear something up, which people who are historically fairly literate or who've just been following our podcast will already be well aware of, the Holy Roman Empire is not the Roman Empire. It's a kind of greater Germany and the dominant state in the West for all of the Middle Ages, really. So him, Frederick II, that emperor, he leads the Sixth Crusade, even though he has been excommunicated by the Pope because of quarrelling between the empire and the papacy, which was a very, very frequent feature of the Middle Ages. And he arrived in Acre. Just to remind people, Acre is on the west-facing coast of the Levant, with forces that were too small to capture Jerusalem. So it wasn't very well managed, but he did succeed in getting a jurisdiction over the Holy City anyway by negotiating with Sultan Al-Kamil.
So the same sultan is in charge, and he offers again to give them Jerusalem, and this time they accept.
Yeah, it's almost like he's trying to get rid of Jerusalem as a way of just getting rid of whatever the latest Crusader force is. So it doesn't seem very precious to him as it had done to many of his predecessors. But in fact, even though he hands it over to them, they only keep it for 15 years, as we're about to see. So the Seventh Crusade is launched in 1248 because Jerusalem had been lost again to a later Muslim ruler in 1244. And this crusade is led by Louis IX, Saint Louis of France.
So this time it's the King of France leading, not the German Emperor. Is there a reason for that?
Well, friction between the German Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France was a constant of European politics over many centuries. And during this period and for long after, one of the things they were vying for was control of the papacy itself. So there's a tendency, let's not put it any stronger than that, to have, say, a pro-German pope and a crusade called that doesn't include many French, like the last one, or as here, a pro-French pope calling a crusade led by the French and with relatively few Germans.
And why is he called Saint Louis? I'm guessing he was extremely pious.
Yeah, he was. We're going to see that he actually goes on two crusades. This is the first of them, but he was generally known for his piety. So yeah, he ends up being canonized as Saint Louis. Like the Fifth Crusade 30 years earlier, the aim was to invade the Nile Delta in order to induce the Sultan to yield up Jerusalem, which, as we've said, had been lost again in 1244, and that's the reason this crusade is called. So, as in the Fifth Crusade, Damietta was again captured, much more quickly this time. Didn't take 18 months, it was pretty quick capture. But two important battles were lost after that in February and April 1250. Louis himself was captured, and most of his soldiers were killed or captured. Well, he was ransomed after a month, and he went to Acre, where he stayed for 4 years, basically acting as the ruler of what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem before returning to France. So crusading was awfully important to him. Well, let's take a look at the map here, and we can see how this kind of worked out. So they're coming from France, across the Mediterranean, stopping off in Cyprus, then going down to Damietta in Egypt, and then Mansoura, where they're defeated in battle. And Louis, at least, but not most of his soldiers, then goes to Acre on the coast, and he's there for 4 years before heading home. Now let's look at the Eighth Crusade in 1270, and in some ways, this is one of the most ridiculous of the lot. There are complicated negotiations between the Pope and Christian powers on the one side and Mongol leaders who were pressing into the Middle East on the other to attack the Muslims. And Louis IX, who's by now very old, embarked on a crusade against Tunis.
Mongols? Where did they suddenly come from?
Well, where did they suddenly come from? The short answer is Central Asia, silly. But they had exploded out of Central Asia into China and becoming the rulers of China, setting up a dynasty there. They had destroyed Kievan Rus, which is a kind of ancestor state of, let's say, Ukraine and Russia. But anyway, get into that whole hornet's nest, and stormed on into Eastern Europe, absolutely smashing up the kingdom of Hungary/Croatia. They seemed unstoppable. But apart from that, they also advanced on the Middle East, perpetrating the most terrible massacres of entire city populations in places like Baghdad. And this was mostly in the 1220s, 1230s, and on after that, because the Mongol pressure continued. Well, they professed to favor the Christian powers over the Muslim ones and started to put out diplomatic feelers to the West. Why don't you attack the Muslim powers from one side while we attack them from the other? And the Western powers, who were certainly not able to defeat the Mongols, felt maybe it's best to become their allies then. So they get involved in this ridiculous maneuver. Not only are they going to Egypt rather than the Holy Land, they're not even going to Egypt, they're going to Tunis, which is completely at the wrong end of North Africa. It's the western end, it's the Maghreb, right? So they capture a fort outside the city of Tunis. And Louis dies on campaign, not from battle wounds, he just dies. And so the two sides stopped fighting and they agreed a treaty, the Treaty of Tunis, in November 1270. And under the terms of the treaty, the Crusaders were given indemnity, that means they were given money, an agreement to trade freely with Tunis, and permission for Christian monks and nuns to live in the city.
Well, that wasn't much of a triumph then, was it?
No, not really. It doesn't advance them 1 inch towards their supposed goal of regaining Jerusalem. I mean, they're just as far away from it as if they'd stayed at home, frankly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, the Siege of Acre in 1291. The Crusader stronghold of strongholds, the city of Acre, finally fell, and the population were either massacred or enslaved in 1291, and that marks the last significant Crusader toehold in the Levant. Now, there is rhetoric amongst Western rulers about calling another crusade for long after that, at least a couple of hundred years later, but it was precisely that, empty rhetoric, right? Nothing was going to happen. The crusading period was, in effect, over.
So we're back at square one, essentially, and all the captured territories are now lost. Had the Crusades all been for nothing?
Militarily, yes. But as we're about to see, they had yielded all kinds of other consequences, many of which are still with us.
We should mention all the other Crusades, though, the minor ones that don't have a number attached to them.
Oh, yeah, if we try to cover them all, this series would go on for ages. There was the Barons' Crusade, the German Crusade, the Peasants' Crusade, the Children's Crusade.
What? The Children's Crusade?
A monstrous tragedy, of course. Maybe just Google it.
Oh no. Before we move on here, could we just take a moment to remind our viewers that if you're enjoying this kind of discussion, would you please like, subscribe, and repost this link on your social media and tell your friends about it?
Yeah, please. As you may have observed, even many supposed history podcasts are in fact related in a way to feed our present culture wars, or that take current left wing or right wing or religious or secularist assumptions for granted. This is a channel that pushes back on that trend.
Exactly. And now back to the episode. So, the Middle East was not the only zone of conflict between Islam and the West.
No, no. The other really important one was the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. The Muslims had invaded Visigothic Spain at the beginning of the 8th century, and for a while ruled almost all of it. And it led to a very interesting mixing and cohabitation of cultures, which is a newly fashionable thing to study. Certainly for the last quarter century, it has been, what can we say, a groovy subject. I know I'm incapable of uttering that expression without the sarcasm drooling out of my mouth, but if you can mentally subtract that, it is a cool subject today in many college curricula. So let's take a look at this map. This is Al Andalus. That's how it looked in 756. So basically, almost the entire peninsula, except most of the Basque country in the north there, is under Muslim rule.
This surely didn't mean that the whole population of the peninsula became Muslim.
No, few people were really converted at the point of a sword, any more than they were in other lands conquered by the Muslims. I mean, that did happen. People forcibly Islamized at the point of a sword, but that wasn't the general way of things. But there were all kinds of advantages to becoming a Muslim if you lived under Muslim rulers. You had legal advantages. You were able to carry a weapon, and you weren't if you weren't a Muslim. People often wore distinctive clothing to show which confession they were part of. There were also financial advantages. So non-Muslims were charged a head tax, the jizya, and you could avoid that by becoming a Muslim. The thing is, this was a one-way ratchet. So even if only 1 or 2% of the population converted in a generation, that had a cumulative effect over centuries. And when I say it's a one-way ratchet, what I mean is you were allowed to continue to be a Christian or a Jew, and there were plenty of Jews in Spain as well, but you absolutely were not allowed to try and convert a Muslim. Otherwise, you would lose your life. And if someone did convert away from Islam, they would lose their life as well. Over time, it amounted to maybe 20 or 30% of the population, something like that. It was significant, but it wasn't absolutely wholesale. In North Africa, in the long, long run, the whole population, apart from in Egypt, was Islamized. Not so in Spain. Now, if we look at this next map, we can see that by 1035, still about 250 years before the period we've just been looking at, we've got the re-emergence of Christian kingdoms in the north. So the area of Muslim control is in green there.
Al-Andalus is the Arabic name for Muslim Spain.
Yes, and it's reflected in the name of the region, Andalusia, that we still have today. Now, by late in the Middle Ages, the area of Muslim control had shrunk to the Kingdom of Granada in the south. That's the grey shaded area there.
Now, I know that you're very queasy about the name Reconquista for this whole process. Why is that?
Well, because it kind of says things that are not true. It obviously means reconquest, and that implies a unity of purpose. Let's drive the Muslims out. And that's not really true, except probably in the very last stages. Then I think it is true in the 15th century. But before that, it's simply a more natural process, so to speak, if alliances between medieval warlords can count as a natural process. Um, People making alliances according to local advantages at the time. And sometimes you get Muslims and Christians fighting against Christians, or Muslims and Christians fighting against Muslims. But the long run effect was to whittle down the area of Muslim control. And then by the time you get to very late in the game, then yes, it probably is an effort to simply drive the Muslims out. Also, the trouble with Reconquista is it feeds into modern nationalist consciousness. We, the Spanish, drove out them, the Muslims. And of course, it's not really like that.
Mm.
And loads of Spanish people had become Muslims during that process. So it's another one of these terms, a bit like the Risorgimento for the arrival of Italian nationalism in the 19th century, resurgence. And I want to say, well, more like surgence, because it assumes there had been something before when there wasn't.
Right.
Or enlightenment, as though pushing back on religion somehow makes everything better, when, we've got mass murder on a vast scale in the 20th century to indicate the opposite. I just think some of these terms applied to historical periods are misleading or propaganda at best. And I'm afraid, in my book, Reconquista comes into that list. Yeah. Sorry, that was a longer answer than you wanted, but there you go.
No worries, thank you. And it's currently fashionable to idealize Islamic Spain as a model of religious tolerance and harmony. Do you think that's justified?
It's fashionable to argue this because lots of people in academia want to take pot shots at Christianity, or they want to pacify the new Muslim constituencies in Western countries, or something like that, right? That's part of it. But it's not that there's nothing to this. In Christian Europe, Christian probably in thick quotation marks there, you couldn't be anything other than a member of the official church, except you could be Jewish, but even then you were given a really hard time. But nothing else. So, yeah, it was very intolerant. Whereas in the dar-al-Islam, the areas that were governed by Muslims, you could be a Christian or a Jew. They were and are, in the Muslims' book, the people of the book. And so they're to have at least some level of respect, as long as it's made clear every day of their lives that they have second-class status. But they're not generally forced to become Muslims, even if the pressure is all that way. And the other thing that has to be said in favour of the fashionable opinion is that because of this, there was a lot of interchange artistically and intellectually and culturally between Christendom and Islam in a way that wasn't really true more generally. Well, something similar is true in Sicily, which was under Arabic rule for a century or two. Yeah. So there is something to be said in favour of it, even if that gets overblown because of present culture wars. So in respect of that, let's just think about this guy, Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, of course, had lived in the 4th century BC, before there was any Islam, before there was any Christianity either. He had been a tutor to Alexander the Great, for goodness sake. But his writings had been pretty much lost to the West during the course of the Middle Ages, really after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But they had been preserved in the East, particularly in the Muslim world. And he had a big influence on a number of key Muslim thinkers, certainly in Spain. And then that was communicated to the Christian West. And the reintroduction of his writings to the West would completely dominate its intellectual life, including its theology, down to the 16th century. So that's down to Muslim contacts. The other big thing that we should mention is the area of mathematics. Now, the chap on the left here, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizm, he'd lived centuries before, as you can see, from around 780 to around 850. And he'd developed the basis for algebra in his book, Al-Jibr. And by the way, his name, Al-Khwarizmi, doesn't sound much like algorithm, but you can just about see that it is indeed derived from his name.
Hmm.
And that too is transmitted to the West through these channels. We should also mention in Italian Leonardo Bonacci, more popularly known as Fibonacci, who lived around 1170 down to the middle of the 13th century. And his statue's on the right there. And he's a scholar from Pisa, as in the Leaning Tower of, so in northern Italy. And he encountered Arabic numerals and algebra in North Africa and popularized them in Italy.
We're not very used to seeing statues of famous Muslims because Muslims themselves don't like statues.
And that's why that statue of Al Khwarizmi is in Madrid and not, say, in Baghdad, which was where he was most active. That's exactly why.
It's almost unimaginable what our world would look like today if we still use Roman numerals, and yet Arabic numerals didn't catch on very fast, did they?
No, no. They took centuries, really, to take hold in the West. Maybe another 300 years after Fibonacci. And I don't know why that is, because this is not really my area of expertise. I simply know that it is. You know, as soon as one even begins to think about how much easier, not just because we're used to them, but intrinsically easier Arabic numerals are than Roman numerals, it's very hard to understand why people didn't immediately go, oh my goodness, this is way easier. Let's just do this. Yeah, yeah.
And math isn't really my area of expertise either, but maybe someone can drop a comment. I'm certain that Fibonacci developed the Fibonacci sequence in math, so if that's correct, let me know.
Yes, please do. And please explain to this poor mere historian what the Fibonacci sequence was, but in words of not longer than two syllables, please, or I'll miss it. Actually, I should ask my son. He's a maths teacher, so
Oh, go.
I'm sure he knows what it is. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Now, the Crusades today have a very bad rap.
Yeah, they really do. We do not think much of the Crusades today. Just a week or so ago, I was mingling in some particular social group. I will spare you all of the details, but there were a number of older Brits over here. And I was talking to one of these ladies, and she talked about how she had become a Christian when she was very young through her church's Crusaders group. I almost wanted to laugh because even I am old enough to remember when that was a thing, but it would be absolutely unthinkable that any group would want to call themselves that today. But what made the situation even more hilarious was that as she was talking to me, sitting right next to her was a young Muslim guy from Egypt.
Oh no. Oh boy.
But fortunately, I think he wasn't paying close attention to the conversation. So catastrophe was avoided.
Oh man. You really, really hate most historical movies, don't you?
I really, really do hate most historical movies. Yes. And here's a classic case in point. It's not that there's never a good one, but that most of the time, and certainly including this one, what you have is the hero of the movie is essentially some postmodern Western smarty pants poncing around in ancient fancy dress, representing the opinions of the Hollywood movie maker and showing why all these people in the past were terrible and wicked and wrong. And that's essentially what's going on here, too. And I was quite gratified to find that this monstrosity had in fact been panned by a lot of historians, though I think that didn't fully rescue the situation. I think it was a commercial success.
Oh.
So Jonathan Riley Smith says this is Osama bin Laden's version of history, which would fuel the Islamic fundamentalists. Well, that might be a little bit over the top, but perhaps that would have been a thought more quickly resorted to in 2005, just 4 years after 9/11, than we would today. Right, but still, that was his take on it. And John Harlow of the Times noted that Christianity is portrayed in an unfavorable light. What, in Hollywood? Can you believe it? And the value of Christian belief is diminished, especially in the portrayal of Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem. So there's a tendency in loads of these movies to make any religious figure evil or corrupt or sinister in some way. But perhaps the most damning criticism comes from Thomas Madden. It's lamentable that there's so large a gulf between what professional historians know about the Crusades and what the general population believes. This movie only widens that gulf. Now, as someone who's spent most of his career teaching history, that really, really resonates with me. Teaching, say, a class of freshmen or something like that, you'd be talking to them about whatever subject it is we're dealing with. And then every now and again, somebody's eyes would light up. Oh, I saw a movie about this.
Oh.
And I would groan because it meant they were more ignorant about the subject than if they'd seen nothing at all, because they now think they know something and they don't. So you then have work to do to debunk all of that before you can then get back to the advanced stage of a tabula rasa, in which we're building from the ground up. And I'm glad that Thomas Madden can see this too. The shame of it is that dozens of distinguished historians across the globe would have been only too happy to help Scott and Monaghan get it right.
So you agree with these historians then?
Yeah, I do. And concerning that last point there, I mean, certainly there were historians across the world who would have helped them get it right, but you know what? They didn't want it.
Right.
Now, partly this may be because of their own opinions that they wanted to promote, but also there's something much bigger going on. The way to make a successful movie or TV program or a news show, or indeed to be a successful and big money preacher, is to pander to people's existing beliefs. If you're a manipulative preacher, what you do is reconcile religious language or rhetoric with the things that they want to believe anyway. This is why name it and claim it preachers can outstrip people preaching orthodox faith by 50 to 1 every time in terms of money, people, everything. And then you and I stand there and beat our breasts and say, why are people so easily deceived? Because they want to be. And the same thing applies if you're doing a news channel, right? You're far better not communicating actual knowledge and understanding, but playing to people's existing beliefs and telling them how right they are to hate the group that they hate or whatever it is, to think the things they already think. And movies, the same. So it's extremely frustrating, and I don't really know the solution to it. If anybody has a solution, please leave us something in the comments, and please try to leave out expletives as you write it.
In social psychology, we call it confirmation bias.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Confirmation bias. That is the way to sell stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so the historical reputation of the Crusades. So they tended to be viewed as heroic, whether on pious grounds or in more recent centuries, at least on proud Western grounds, up to, let us say, the early 20th century. And then things were a little more neutral for a few decades around the middle of the century. And more recently, they've been viewed as shameful, a view from which actually I don't dissent. I do agree. I find it rather weird to be a man of my own time in anything, but I do go along with this. And I think we quoted Sir Stephen Runciman on this point. Nothing more, the Crusades were nothing more than a long act of intolerance in the name of God, which is a sin against the Holy Ghost. Bernard Lewis, a historian of the Middle East, of whom much more in a moment, takes a more considered view, and he sees the Crusades as a late, limited, and unsuccessful imitation of the Muslim jihad. Or, and I can't remember exactly where he says this, but I know that he does, he views them as a series of failed counterattacks against Muslim expansionism. Now, what sort of attitude towards the Crusades did you encounter, whether in school, in church, or at home growing up?
I think because growing up was Nazarene, so basically Wesleyans in denial, I think that there was definitely kind of like, oh, just blame the Catholics and forget about it. But in reality,
My goodness,
yeah,
really?
right. In reality, though, going to college and learning more about the historic church, that doesn't really apply.
Okay, well, let's spend a little bit of time with this guy, Bernard Lewis. He was a secular Jew, British, lived, as you can see, to be, well, you'd think 102. Actually, he was 101. He didn't quite make his 102nd birthday. He moved to the States when he was, I think, 57, where he was even more successful than he had been in Britain and was lionized by particularly the then ascendant neoconservative faction. But we needn't dive into all of that. So he thought that modern Western contrition over the Crusades was a mistake. He says, we have seen in our own day the extraordinary spectacle of a pope apologizing to the Muslims for the Crusades. I would not wish to defend the behavior of the Crusaders, which was in many respects atrocious. But let's have a little sense of proportion. We're now expected to believe that the Crusades were an unwarranted act of aggression against a peaceful Muslim world. Hardly. The first papal call for a crusade occurred in 846, when a naval expedition from Arab-ruled Sicily, estimated by contemporaries at 73 ships and 10,000 men, sailed up the Tiber and attacked Rome. They briefly seized Ostia. Ostia is the port outside Rome, and Porto, and plundered St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and St. Paul's Cathedral on the right bank of the Tiber. He's got a point, although 846 is still, 250 years before the actual First Crusade. So you can't really look at it as a motivation, some kind of revenge. People don't think like that. Nobody acts nowadays to take revenge for something that happened 250 years ago. But he does have a point about a sense of proportion. Here he is comparing jihad and crusade. Jihad is sometimes presented as the Muslim equivalent of the crusade, as more or less equivalent. In a sense, this is true. Both were proclaimed and waged as holy wars for the true faith against an infidel enemy. But there is a difference. The crusade is a late development in Christian history and, in a sense, marks a radical departure from basic Christian values as expressed in the Gospels. Christendom had been under attack since the 7th century. Muhammad had died in 632, and that's the point at which Islam explodes out of the Arabian Peninsula into the Middle East and on, and had lost vast territories to Muslim rule. Yet in the long struggle between Islam and Christendom, the crusade was late, limited, and of relatively brief duration. Jihad is present from the beginning of Islamic history, in scripture, the Quran, in the life of the Prophet, and in the actions of his companions and immediate successors. It's continued throughout Islamic history and retains its appeal to the present day. And as you can see, he was writing that book in 2003, so just 2 years after 9/11.
No, Lewis was pretty unpopular in the Muslim world, right?
Yeah, when you read a passage like that, you can kind of see why. He's often attacked for not having even been to the Middle East for many decades. But frankly, because of the kind of things that he said, he would have been putting himself in severe personal danger going there. But he had spent quite a bit of time there earlier in his career. And I mean, he was an absolute expert in his field. He knew all of the sources and so on. Various people writing about him have said that actually he loved the Middle East, even though he was really, really disappointed by a lot of Muslim actions in the present and in recent centuries. So, yeah, he's not exactly the favorite amongst Muslims. And here he is talking about Christendom and the Dar-al-Islam and which was more tolerant. Well, in the past, during the long struggles between the Muslims and Christians in both Eastern and Western Europe, there could be little doubt that the Muslims were far more tolerant, both of other religions and of diversity within their own religion, than were the Christians. In medieval Western Christendom, massacres and expulsions, inquisitions and immolations were commonplace. That's a bit tricky. Massacres on religious grounds in Western Christendom? There were massacres of Jews, indeed. That certainly did happen. But in wide swathes of population, no, because there weren't enough non Christians to direct this against. In Islam, they were atypical and rare. By the late 17th century, the practical situation was much better in Western Europe than in Islamic lands. And from that time onward, the one got better, the other got worse. And that is a valid observation, which anybody with even a cursory knowledge of recent centuries would have to agree with. Right. Well, let's turn to something much more at the level of popular culture now, and that is C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories. Now, the Calormens are a creation of his. In these stories, they appear in several of the books, especially the final one, The Last Battle, and they clearly reflect Western images, stereotypes, you might say, of the Muslim world. I don't know what you remember about this subject when you were growing up and having Narnia stories read to you, or maybe reading them. Was it apparent to you at the time that that's who these people really were?
No, definitely not. I think reading these books, my imagination kind of drew it up for me. But yeah, after learning more about it, I think that it's definitely what his little joke.
Yes, I think it is something of a little joke. And we have to remember that Lewis, in his day job, was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature.
Yeah.
So all of this imagery is constantly saturating pretty much everything he wrote, certainly the Narnia books, and not just on this topic.
Hmm.
Yeah. So when describing these people that he's created, and I think I'm right in saying that this particular illustration is from The Horse and His Boy.
Hmm.
He says, the Calormens have dark faces and long beards. They wear flowing robes and orange coloured turbans. And they're a wise, wealthy, courteous, cruel, and ancient people. They bowed most politely to Caspian and paid him long compliments all about the fountains of prosperity irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue and things like that. But of course, what they wanted was the money they'd paid.
And again, this is him reflecting Western stereotypes about the Muslim world, all inherited from the Crusades.
Yes, and his little joke there about the Calormen's use of florid language, which is certainly typical of Arab public speeches. I mean, this was very much on display, for example, by Saddam Hussein at the time of the Second Gulf War, and the first indeed, right, in which we had to decode what he was saying from what he was not saying. So there would be all kinds of fearsome rhetoric but certain things were not said, from which people in the know could realize that he was, under the guise of saying blood-curdling things, actually making a concession. This kind of stuff.
That's very British, isn't it?
Multiplied by about 100, I suppose. Yes. No, it goes much, much further in the Arab world. Here we've got Lewis talking about the Calormens and their storytelling. For in Calormens, storytelling, whether the stories are true or made up, is a thing you're taught, just as English boys and girls are taught essay writing. The difference is that people want to hear the stories, whereas I never heard of anyone who wanted to read the essays.
But storytelling is an important art form among all pre-modern peoples, right?
Yes, yes. The Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings had storytelling as one of their main art forms. But nevertheless, I think insofar as his joke has any bite at all, it's because that still continued, perhaps in the Muslim world in his day, but had long died out in modernized countries like Britain, where kids were reduced to writing tedious essays in school. In summary, the First Crusade was by far the most successful. It captured Jerusalem and established Crusader states in the Levant.
And that first crusade was covered in the first episode of the series.
The states came under serious pressure by the 1140s. The Second Crusade from 1147 to 49 was a failed attempt to strengthen them. And then Jerusalem was lost in 1187. And the Third Crusade, 1189 to 92, was a partially successful attempt to rescue something from disaster.
And the second and third crusades were covered in our second episode of the series as well.
Right, so please go back and have a look at that episode, yes. And the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 05, was a disaster that never even reached the Holy Land. It sacked Constantinople, and the result of that was deepening the rift between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East.
In that fourth crusade, we did cover in our third episode of the Crusade series.
Yep, that was the one immediately previous to this, yes. Later crusades were similarly fiascos that achieved very little, and we've given them short shrift in this episode here. The crusades sharpened mutual perceptions in the West and the Muslim world. For each, the other was the definitive enemy.
Would you say that Islam and the West are still one another's definitive enemies?
Well, from the end of the Cold War until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you'd have said yes. Now, despite the Iran war that's going on as we record this, I think most people would say no. But in the long term, that's probably the way to think about things. You know, it gets hotter and it gets cooler. But in the long term, yeah, I think they probably are one another's definitive enemies, even if not at any particular given moment in time.
Why do you think they would say no now?
Well, because I think that, as Samuel Huntington predicted in his magnificent Clash of Civilizations and Remaking of World Order, that the Islamist violence threat, whilst it certainly wouldn't go away, would peak out after about 2015. And I think he was right. It's not that the threat has gone away, but it's not as acute now as it was 20 years ago.
Fair enough.
Staying with our in summary, then, the verdict on the Crusades. What could be said for them? Well, they were viewed as heroic or pious. That was the Crusaders' own self-assessment. We could today view them simply as standard power politics in the Middle Ages, even if a slightly extraordinary series of episodes. Or we could agree with Bernard Lewis that they were an understandable or perhaps even a justifiable pushback against Muslim expansionism. What tends to be said con? Well, that they constituted the invasion of a more civilized society by a more barbaric one. And there's not much doubt that the medieval West was much less civilized than the Middle East during that period of time. Negative perceptions are also kind of a subset of Western self loathing in our own time, which is epitomized by accusations of Orientalism.
Honestly, I forget. What is Orientalism?
Well, originally, Orientalism was the strong interest of many Western academics, not just historians, but artists, people interested in comparative cultures, anthropology, and so on, in the East generally, not just the Middle East, but maybe even Asia, China, India, and so on. But since the publication in, I think it's about 1978, of Edward Said's appalling book, Orientalism, which calculatedly fed into Western self loathing, he wanted to insist that basically all Western attempts at scholarship about the non West were judgmental, assessed non Western cultures by standards that were not their own, and were thoroughly mistaken and coming from a place of totally unwarranted senses of superiority. Now, it's not to say that some Western scholarship hasn't done that. That's certainly true. But he was effectively scything down anything that Westerners could possibly say about non Western cultures. And lots of groovy postmodern type academics have fed into that, not just in respect of the Middle East, but other areas of the world as well. And inveterate book buyer that I am, when looking at some new history book, that's one of the first things I look for. Is it contaminated by this ridiculous way of approaching things? And if it is, then I simply leave it be and pass on for something a little more rational. But that has fed into exaggerated negative assessments of the Crusades. But also a subset of secularist discourse, negativity about Christianity. Now, please don't get me wrong here. This is not to say that the Crusades weren't appalling. They were appalling. But they are a handy stick for secularists to beat Christianity with. And they're also a subset of pro-Muslim discourse. That's another aspect of the same thing. There are now fairly hefty Muslim populations in most Western countries, and this is one way either of placating them, or perhaps they're perfectly capable of being spokesmen in their own cause, and so they will argue along these lines too. But another way of looking at it, a very negative assessment, and I'm afraid it would be my own, is that it's the quintessence, or it's the logical conclusion of terrible theology and the distortion of Christianity. Once you have accepted the false idea that Christianity is a program for running society, that you can have such a thing as a Christian state, well, essential early Christian theology is going to be stood on its head, which is exactly what happened in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, and stuff that we deal with in our series on the end of the early church for people who want to look at that in more detail, because there's so much to be said about it. But once you've made that move, you're going to want to justify warfare, because states occasionally need to go to war, and you're going to justify it in religious terms. And that, in the end, is going to lead you to conduct religious wars. And at that point, you are an awfully long way from home. And of course, that's what the Crusades were.
And this is the point, that if you try to make Christianity a way of running society as a whole...
Yeah, it's never intended to be. And as I've said, it becomes that from the 4th century onwards.
Yeah, then religious war and dragging Christ's name through the mud is where you will end up.
That is where it ended up. That's what the Crusades are, yeah. let's just finish by waving a couple of useful and compendious books at our viewers, both by Jonathan Riley Smith. They're not particularly cheap. The Oxford Illustrated History of the Crusades. So it looks at all of the Crusades, but lots of pictures in there. And Jonathan Riley Smith is a serious historian. And for people who want to follow all of this in detail on maps, we've got the Atlas of the Crusades. So we'd recommend that to you as well.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this series, everyone, and that it helped you think more deeply about what the Crusades meant at that time and their legacy today.
Thank you for staying with us, everyone. And please don't forget that like, subscribe, and share thing. And see you in 2 weeks for a brand new series. Bye bye now.